call our burger of change. We're interested in strong institutional performance for shared water security. And in terms of the roles of FCDO, what an opportunity there is to provide intelligent technical assistance and system strengthening. We also need to look at the financing for water security to address the huge financing gap. Yeah, to close the financing gap, and we discussed, water institutions need strong accountability monitoring and oversight because of the nature of the task. The end of the last session was to introduce the idea or the potential of how the ideas of water footprinting, water stewardship, and private sector engagement can help with this and potentially provide some special source to address or to reshape the political economy around water management and water institutions to accelerate progress, which leads us to the start of today. So what we'd like to do is to provide a brief history of water stewardship and water footprinting and some common definitions. And these ideas have been around for what, 12, 10, 15 years. We're going to shake down the conceptual model of stewardship to see where we are today, to identify the priorities for progress for fairer water footprints. So, history of the topic. We are a huge debt to Tony Allen, who passed away sadly last month. Tony invented the idea of virtual water, which really reflects that producing food, clothes, produce requires water, and that embedded water in products and food in particular explains why we haven't seen water walls, and explains how trade can overcome local constraints around water availability. So Tony, building on Tony's work, Arjen Hoekstra developed this idea into water footprinting, a really important development. So Arjen's work enabled us to see that, for example, in the UK, whilst every UK citizen consumes about 1 bathtub of water, 150 litres of water a day, directly of UK water, we're also dependent on water in the world, and we use 30 bathtubs a day of other people's water, which is embedded in the food, clothes, and products we consume. So together, this work enables us to start asking really interesting questions about water dependency, the water footprint of nations, of products, of food, of companies, of cities, of catchments, to help us think about, to connect the dots between global consumption and the water governance challenges in those places. Now, what's important to recognise is that a water footprint per se isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's lots of water available out there in the world that can be used with minimal or a benign effect on the environment or downstream uses. What's important is whether the water footprint is sustainable or not, and we'll come back to that. The work that Arjen and his team have been doing is starting to ask the questions about whether water footprints are sustainable. This map shows some work on the efficiency of the water footprint. Now, I'm not sure we talked about efficiency last week. You've probably come across this in your water learning journey. Just be careful about water efficiency. There's a lot of effort around efficiency. Efficiency is dead important, but efficiency doesn't equal sustainable use, right? And lots of research suggests that the more efficient water use is, it's actually a driver to increase demand because water use becomes more profitable. So just be careful in avoiding singular outcome targets on water efficiency. It's important, but it's the sustainability and equity of water use which is fundamental. It's also important to recognise the work of some knockout NGOs out there who put water stewardship on the agenda, particularly in India. Sunita Narain's work at CSE really put corporate water use on the global map with their work on Coca-Cola's influence on sustainable groundwater use in India, and made real this idea of reputational water risk. All of a sudden, companies started to be interested in water governance because of the kind of financial hits that Coke was seeing, losing billions of dollars because of basically having their factories located in a groundwater aquifer which wasn't well managed, and they were associated, got some of the blame for that. So water footprinting, virtual water, reputational water risk, all of a sudden companies, not water utility companies, but companies that used a lot of water in their value chains, were forced or became interested in water use and governance and their water performance. For example, we were funded by DFID to look at the implications of the UK's water footprint through the case study of Peru. And we found that 90% of the world's asparagus was produced in the Ica Desert, which you can see is one of the driest places on the planet, fed by groundwater. We tracked the sustainability of that, and there's probably no better example on the planet of stupid resource use, right? It's so unsustainable to the extent that the groundwater level's going down up to 5 meters a year. Most of the world's asparagus is sourced there. All the UK supermarkets use Peruvian asparagus, and that's driving conflict, people being shot over boreholes, and the rapid destruction of the industry. So self-destructive industry. As I said, all the UK supermarkets source from that area, and the products from ICA are labelled as sustainable, and the whole enterprise is established by IFC and World Bank investment. The response to these issues has been the development of the concept and practice of water stewardship. So that water stewardship or stewardship is simply taking care of something that you don't own. Here, a definition has been provided by the Alliance for Water Stewardship, where we said that, for disclosure, I was involved in writing this and set up the Alliance for Water Stewardship with many others. But we defined it as the 3 pillars of sustainability: that water usage needs to be socially equitable, environmentally sustainable, and economically beneficial, achieved through actions, stakeholder engagement, actions at site and catchment scale. Now, the big opportunity here, go back to our burger of change. The big opportunity is to ask whether, by harnessing the significant political influence, communications influence, reach, and resources of the private sector, can water stewardship not only drive sustainable use in their value chains, and that's significant. You know, consider 1 in 5 people work in a globalized supply chain, so the scale is significant. Can we drive not just sustainable use in the supply chain, but help to shape the political economy around water for the benefit of everybody? So can we trigger systemic change through bringing new actors, new corporate actors, to bargain and push for the improved water governance that those of in civil society have been pushing for years? Of course, the corollary to that is there a risk that private sector engagement in water will invite securitization for those companies, resource and policy capture? Now, that's not just the paranoia of an NGO. Companies are legally mandated or legally required to serve the needs of their shareholders, right? So that doesn't always line up with the needs of people in the catchments where they work. So that's a real risk. Recognised early on, and again, DFID, when they launched the IWASP program, funded the Water Integrity Network and the Sea Water Mandate and ourselves to develop some integrity guidelines for water stewardship, defined as credible and accountable partners, working through balanced, inclusive and transparent processes to deliver demonstrable public good outcomes. That's really important. We'll come back to that, but the links there are a really important bit of work. So, water stewardship. The idea is, in this model, that companies are driven to do the right thing on water because they face physical water risks, all right? So interruptions to production because of lack of water or pollution of the water supply. Financial water risk because of the cost of water and the costs of higher levels of treatment. Regulatory water risk of being fined and punished for breaches of law, and reputational water risk. So the idea that the public won't buy your stuff if you're polluting or causing problems, or you'll lose investment from sensitive or investment pressure. And that those drivers will get companies to do the right thing, site level and in their supply chains, but also beyond their site in the contexts where they exist. So at national level, at basin level, at municipal scale, because obviously a company's water risks is determined not just by what they do, but by what happens upstream and downstream where they're using water. Now, the idea is that that engagement will drive improvements across outcomes, including WASH, pollution control, water quality, sustainable water use, nature-based solutions, protected ecosystems, and improved water governance, so that everybody has shared water security as a result. And that engagement will provide positive feedback to address and mitigate the water risks they face: physical, financial, regulatory, reputational. Yeah, both by action at a site level and beyond the site, right? So there's a positive feedback loop is assumed. Now, if we reappraise this model 10 years in, we can definitely say a few things, right? And this analysis is supported by some evaluation done by ODI and IUCN and some of our own work. So we can definitely say that this part of the puzzle is in place. So there is a mechanism that enables companies to take action at site level in their supply chains that drives these outcomes. That mechanism is the Alliance for Water Stewardship Standard. So I'm sure you're familiar with how voluntary standards work, a series of steps against the outcomes I've mentioned, independent verification and certification of credible claims, so that it's an accountability mechanism for good water stewardship, which in the context where water governance isn't working, which is much of the world, things like this standard are the only, sometimes the only way to avoid an anarchy, winner grabs all water use, right? So the standard in some parts of the world plays a really important role by imposing voluntary self-regulation, really audited by a third party. Much of our work over the past 10 years has been to understand whether the standard works in difficult places in Africa. And what I can say, and there's independent evaluations about this it works, right? So at site level, it drives full legal compliance with the law and continual improvements in water efficiency, energy efficiency around water use. This is through using it with the likes of Olam, Diageo, Marks and Spencer's across the continent. It drives improved wash provision for workers. And some of the scenes out there are biblical, right, in terms of how particularly plantation workers do not have access to basic wash services. The standard addresses that, and it looks at wash provision in the communities where workers live. It also stimulates engagement in better water governance. So it stimulates the right questions to ask of government water regulators and providers to drive action on shared issues, and helps establish things like water user associations. And we've seen how that works. Importantly, the standard gets companies to ask questions about their own supply chains. And that's a really powerful mechanism, right? So if you've got a brewery, for example, in Uganda or here in Tanzania, that's supplied by several hundred barley farmers, the standard requires the site to understand the water risks and the climate risks facing those farmers, and to take action with demonstrable benefit. So here, the graph shows there's a heat map of different issues that face farming communities. And the AWS standard has broken through. It's taken a while. It was launched in 2014. It's now being used by some of the world's biggest companies in 42 countries to guide and recognize responsible water use and contributions to better governance. Here are some of the companies and folks involved: Apple, Unilever, Ecolab, Coke, Diageo, Danone, Google, Nestle. The leaders are now using this to guide and benchmark best practice. But given the nature of the water crisis, the adoption of the standard and its rollout hasn't been as rapid as you might expect. It's still only used by really a handful of sites. We think that there's a problem in this conceptual model that warrants a look at it, right? To say, have we got these ideas right? Are we basing it on the right assumptions, or do we need to rethink it, or do we need to invest in some of these ideas or drivers to get water risks? Definitely exist, right? So companies do run out of water or face pollution, but that can easily lead to the secret pipe, which means that they get water during a drought over and above communities. And there's lots of examples of that. So it can, the physical risks alone aren't enough. Financial water risks, most countries, water's so cheap that it's not really an issue, right? You don't pay for volumetric water use in many countries still. Regulatory water risks, well, the fact that regulation isn't effective is why we need stewardship in the first place, and we talked about that last time. Reputational risks, there are pockets of excellent work out there, but really the idea that civil society and NGOs are looking over the shoulder of corporations is, it's fantasy, it's fairy tale. There simply are not the resources to enable civil society in much of the world to do that work. And increasingly, the freedoms to do that work are being constrained. I think the stats are that in over 60 countries in the past 5 years, there's been new legislation to restrict the freedoms of civil society and citizens calling out these types of issue. So the watchdog role is a bit of a fantasy, and we know that for sure. So there's problems around the drivers, which means that this model isn't working as well as it should be. There's also some insights around the ability of stewardship to drive system change. Okay, so this is the idea that companies can align with civil society and others to lobby for improved water governance, to do advocacy work. What we've seen is very clearly a need for companies to focus on systemic change, right? So they pretty quickly work out that the problems they face can't be addressed by work at site alone. They're embedded in the way that countries are governed and that water's governed. So they need to engage at a different scale. Whilst they recognise that, their ability to engage at that level is limited, and because it's about policy dialogue, accountability and advocacy, and companies, from what we've seen, aren't yet prepared to put their heads above the parapet on those issues, because they're interested in a non-conflictual relationship with government. Often those discussions about reforming of water user fees and charges and difficult things like water and land tenure regimes often involve trade-offs between public water use and private water use. And in many countries, the big issue is not about water governance, it's about those companies paying a fair level of tax to enable governments to deliver the water services that the lack of which are now hurting the companies themselves. So there's some interesting dynamics in there which we see are holding back some company, well, the leaders from being effective at that bigger system change level. How well are these positive feedback loops working? Part of the problem that there are many NGOs out there that are very happy to strike up a partnership with a corporation or a bank, and let them use their logo interchangeably on initiatives for a funding relationship without any performance requirements around that. And that weakens the drivers for change and the legitimacy of water stewardship. So oftentimes a company can simply give an NGO a bunch of money and claim stewardship credentials. We need to think about these feedback mechanisms in more detail, to think about how the financial markets in particular and consumers can recognize and reward, or recognize and punish, good and bad water stewardship, right, to make that driver real. And we wonder whether there's a need for product, enterprise, investment portfolio indicators of water performance. So my conclusions: there's no doubt at all that credible water stewardship offers proven potential to shape and scale sustainable and resilient water use. And what's exciting is that's beyond aid, right? So it's, for example, the AWS system, it's almost ready to be self-financing as a membership network, and the fees and charges within it. So you can scale that up without the need for donor assistance, right? It's a market mechanism which drives systems which drive continual improvement on stewardship. And as I said, that can be scaled up through globalized supply chains. So it's looking at third tier suppliers and their water stewardship. So benefits right down to the farm level. And that drives pollution control, fair withdrawals, full wash access, really important for COVID control and menstrual hygiene management, all the things that the FCD are interested in. Nature-based solutions are in there, ecosystem protection and climate resilience. So really important contributions to sustainable business, ideas of shared value, shared opportunity. The question of whether stewardship can trigger the biggest systemic change is really a live experiment. You know, we're testing this all the time. We're working with the Diageo in Tanzania, looking at reform of land tenure at the moment, right? Because they recognise that's the biggest root cause of their insecurity in their barley supply chains. Really interesting stuff. We've seen some of the limits in terms of the response to the ODA cuts. We're struggling to get corporates to sign up to calling the UK government out on that, despite the obvious links to their water security. Within all of this, learning, M&E, integrity, because of the risks, and evidence must be at the centre. And often, you'd be surprised how often water stewardship initiatives don't have good monitoring, evaluation, and learning around them, which is a hazard. We need to take another look at that stewardship model to unlock focus and incentives, and do that urgently. Universally, the lack of civil society oversight is recognised as a gap. You know, that comes from corporates themselves that say, you know, the reason we're moving on this is reputational risk, and it's not there. We've heard it from the supermarkets. We won't move on water stewardship until it's a big issue for our customers. So there's an opportunity for civil society NGOs to be that part of the change. What we need to do is to make stewardship the expected business norm, embed it in the public and political consciousness to make sure that it's an expected part of practice. And we also need to engage on some of the frontier issues: governance, tax, limits of sustainable consumption, water tenure, and climate. There's a real need to push for alignment and collaboration between the actors. That's happening with support from FCDO and others. But I think, like any emerging field, there's been a number of hairs running, and this diagram here just shows who's out there and some of the names you'll see. There's a real need for making true the Paris Declaration on aid coordination here. In some places there is competition between some of these initiatives, and that's a hazard. There's stakeholder fatigue, confusion, non-efficient investment. So it's important that the connections between these entities are understood and recognised, and that's an ongoing piece of work. So this is the theory of change that we've developed with a bunch of stakeholders and FCDO to think about how we trigger change at the rate and with the urgency that's needed to address the global water crisis. To say here, you can see the civil society oversight pieces at the beginning, really is the engine of some of this change.
My name's Cate Lamb. I'm the Global Director of Water Security at CDP. I've been running our global corporate disclosure transparency mechanism for almost a decade now. And I'm clearly a strong advocate for responsible private sector engagement on water issues. And so what I want to talk to you about today is our experience of this last decade and the new lever that we're just about to pull. We started our water program a decade ago. And at that moment, we were working with around 150 institutional investors with around $15 trillion worth of assets. And they granted us the permission. They don't give us any money, but they granted us the permission to use their name to seek disclosures, water-related disclosures, from a large number of companies. At that time, in 2009, we had about 200 companies invited and responding. And these investors were asking them questions like, are you exposed to water-related risks that might deliver a significant change in your business? And for many of those firms, that was the first time they'd ever considered that question. And when it's asked on behalf of 150 investors, that's a significant question that the board and the chairman and chairperson of the companies generally pay attention to. Now, today, we operate on behalf of over 580 institutional investors with around $106 trillion worth of assets. At the same time, we're leveraging large corporate buyers, many of those who Nick's already mentioned, who also grant us permission to seek disclosure from their suppliers allowing us a really powerful mechanism to drive change within companies. Today, we've got around 3,000 companies responding to us, and these are some of the world's most impactful. They're the largest in some respects, and they're also in sectors that are posing the most risk to water security issues. And we are excited to see an increased interest from in water from business, and appreciate that good water stewardship really does exist. You can see here, so these are the rate of disclosure that we've seen in the last 4 to 5 years. It's consistently growing, which is wonderful. And here, for example, are the number of water-related actions the companies reported to us in 2020. However, we're witnessing a mixed response from many companies, including weak and unsubstantiated claims, inconsequential efforts, meaningless targets, and business models and practices that are fundamentally misaligned. Analysis conducted by my team, and Loreen Misra is joining us today, suggests that while companies are taking action, and we have had some success in moving water-related issues from the boiler room into the boardroom, much of the change has been incremental. We have succeeded, for example, in stabilizing water withdrawals among companies for the very first time in 2020. However, it's safe to say that that 1-year performance does not currently suggest a trend, and we'll be watching that closely once our data is back to us. But you can see here that action on pollution is woeful in the last square there. And when one considers that the companies in food, textile, energy, industrial, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and mining sectors account for and wield influence over 70% of the world's fresh water, the greatest opportunity we have is to change the way in which these companies grow and ensure that they're growing in a way that aligns with our objectives. But in order to do that, we need a spark. And interestingly, or it's important to understand that those institutional investors I mentioned earlier are themselves not subject to disclosure requirements, either from CDP or anywhere else. So in the absence of good governance from national governments, we believe that the capital markets can spark a desire. These are commercial banks, institutional investors, rating agencies, insurance firms, and stock exchanges can offer unique incentives for change by ensuring that their investment and lending practices drive improvements in water security. It's important to point out here the scale of the sector that I'm talking about. The group of 580 investors that I mentioned earlier that work alongside CDP control $120 trillion worth of assets. This is larger than the combined GDP of the USA, China, and the EU. Further, with $124 trillion in assets, the banking industry alone is bigger and more profitable and more powerful than ever before. And when you consider the economic incentives, the behavior change that the lending transactions have on us as individuals, as mortgage holders, as credit card practitioners, we change our behavior depending on the way in which that bank sets conditions around interest rates, for example. The same holds true for many companies, particularly small to medium-sized enterprises who are much more reliant on lending than these larger institutions. And yet, according to JP Morgan, less than 2% of all capital allocation made by all of these financial institutions can be graded as sustainable. That means, in other words, 98% of that $124 trillion worth of assets that are flowing through banks is not rated as sustainable. That's not a good outcome. And so we have to make the assumption that all of that work, all of that capital is actively working against us. It's undermining our ability to achieve a water secure future for all. And this is a really big issue, because when one considers the implications of recent analysis from CDP, the top number, and from WWF, that the environmental impact of these institutions far outweighs their businesses impacts. When one considers that 700 times greater impact in their portfolios than in their offices for financial institutions, we need to start acting more seriously with these institutions. This flow of money is enabling agribusinesses to pump ever-increasing amounts of non-renewable groundwater. It's enabling tailings dams to be built at the heads of free-flowing rivers. And it's enabling chemical, apparel, and pharmaceutical companies to release toxic pollution, much of which is carcinogenic, posing a real and present danger to human health. But it can be the key to changing it all. Imagine if this flow of capital was working in our favour. Imagine if it was providing the incentive, the spark for companies in these sectors to grow and affect freshwater resources differently. Currently, it's possible to get a loan with no environmental conditions tied to it whatsoever. This is the thing we want to change. Now, to date, from a water perspective, the world has been looking at freshwater financial institutions either as a source of direct finance for water projects or as a stewardship mechanism to influence corporate performance, which is the model that CDP has been practicing for the last decade on water, providing the data that these institutional investors need, and in some respects, hoping that they will act upon it. They've been subject to little or no expectation to act, as I said, either from CDP or anybody else. Now, a complete lack of water-related transparency in this sector means that it's currently not possible to establish whether those organisations are indeed aligning their investment and lending practices with the achievement of a water-secure future. And given the state of affairs, I believe it's probably safe to assume that they're not. So we want to change this. And now, thanks to a small grant from the Dutch government, we're going to be changing the tide. It's time for the scrutineers, the investors that have been sitting there demanding data from companies and expecting change from companies, to become the scrutinized. We're about to start developing and then delivering a disclosure mechanism specifically aimed at these financial institutions, which asks them many of the same questions that they ask of the companies themselves. And we believe that this has the potential to trigger a huge systemic cascade effect that will affect not only large publicly listed companies, but companies all over the world. We will be developing the indicators that will ask financial institutions about their water-related impacts in their portfolios, and importantly, ask them about the steps they're taking to mitigate those impacts. And the cascade effect of that is that those financial companies will be forced to go out and ask the companies themselves what they're doing and seek confidence and assurance from those companies that they are practicing good water stewardship. So it's a really powerful mechanism that we then suspect will feed back in to better financial performance, stronger resilience, and ultimately triggering the transformation that we need from incremental to more transformational, revolutionary action. I'm really excited to be taking this work forward. I think there's huge potential still to be tapped. As I mentioned, it's a relatively small pot of money that we're working with on this. But we are really confident that the information that we will spark to be created, if you like, information that currently doesn't exist, we will be making that publicly available to civil society and others who need it to trigger the accountability that's needed. But in addition, the questionnaire that we'll issue has the power to spark dialogues within these institutions that to date are just completely nascent. Many of them are not asking the questions that we know they should be asking. Many of them are not considering the implications of water for their ability to actually get the loan back from companies. And so with that power, I think comes great opportunity. And I really look forward to coming back and reporting back to you in a year or so's time once we've been successful in delivering the questionnaire.